Lord of the Rings, a story about British culture, was shot in New Zealand, where they cast a bunch of local indigenous people to portray the orcs. That's not racism, that's logistics, and the more problematic thing, in my opinion, would be to refuse to give the locals work on your production because you were afraid of optics. Game of Thrones encountered a similar quote-unquote problem at the end of Season 3, when Daenerys is hoisted up by a crowd of brown people.
Be depicted in the TV show too, but there are practicalities with running a TV show. Those scenes were filmed in Morocco, and the people that you see are extras who are paid, $30 a day or something like that to perform, just to be in the background. When you film that, the practicalities are you put out a call for extras, and people show up, and you sign up as many as you need. When you do that in Morocco, Moroccans show up, and
okay, does it look a certain way on screen? Well, sure, if you're looking for something to get offended by, but what would you do? Deny hundreds of local Moroccans a chance to be extras on screen on Game of Thrones in order to appease a small contingent of academics and crybabies on social media? Honestly, in my opinion, to call this racism is to entirely miss the point of why we as a society have decided to address actual racism as a serious issue. If I may offer something that I have found to be true in my experience, please consider the following. If you, as a person of color, go and experience something, and you don't think that what you experience is racism, and then some social justice warrior type comes to you and tells you that no, actually, you may not know it, but what you just experienced actually is racism, that person is misguided. And at best, they are trying to use what they perceive as your status of victimhood to serve their own social clout. A person like that wants you to be a victim, because in their eyes, that allows them to become a hero. But at worst, that person is trying to take advantage of you. Take it from me, when someone experiences actual racism, they don't need anybody to put that in context for them or explain to them what happened. When you are the victim of actual racism, you know it. You don't need an academic to tell you. Just consider that the next time you see accusations of racism being thrown willy-nilly on social media. But that word, racism, oh boy. Oh boy. Once you introduce it to the discourse, well, it seems to stick, doesn't it? I mean, we nerds know that these things we champion were never so sexist, racist, or otherwise problematic as the modern mainstream narrative holds them to be. God damn it, a great many nerds are minorities of one kind or another, who often turned to these beloved stories to escape the bigotry they faced in real life. So when we hear news outlets reporting that modern Star Wars is only just now becoming a safe space for black nerds, it's really hard to take that seriously. Especially for those of us who happen to not be white, who happen to fit into the categories of brown or black nerds, and who have parents who fit into those categories as well.
So to be in any way, shape, or form a part of the wave that is ushering in inclusion and safety for Black nerds, it's my dream come true.
Well, when we see that, we see the absolute absurdity there. Because people of color have always been crucial to the soul of Star Wars since day one, for reasons completely divorced from the color of their skin. I mean, for James Earl Jones, it was his voice that got him the role, for God's sakes, and can anyone imagine anyone else as the voice of Darth Vader? I wonder if there are some young people from Generation Z, or the kids from Generation Alpha, or whatever it is, who are unaware that Darth Vader's original voice is done by an African-American performer. And then we have Lando Calrissian in Empire Strikes Back. Not a token black character, but the real owner of the Millennium Falcon, and the administrator of the Cloud City of Bespin, whom, when we first met him, is thrust into a role that would seem almost villainous were it not for the nuanced characterization that the film provides.
I had no choice. They arrived right before you did. I'm sorry.
But you know, I never played, but I did, when I played Lando, I didn't play him as a black man or a white man or a green. I played him as the full spectrum of colors. I mean, and that's how I play all my characters. And, I'm not interested in pinpointing and sitting in a kind of a narrow, myopic view of who I should be.
And then in the prequels, you've got Mace Windu, who I think many Star Wars fans would agree is one of the coolest characters from the prequel era. I mean, does the purple lightsaber need a single word of explanation for why it's so dope? No, it fucking doesn't. It just rocks.
This party's over.
I will also point out that Attack of the Clones features Temuera Morrison, a Maori performer, playing Jango Fett. Like, these people out there arguing that Star Wars is only now becoming a safe haven for people of color, they clearly haven't watched the original stuff. I mean, what kind of nerd isn't aware of that? But that's the problem right there. Nerds know that our favorite stories aren't toxic or hateful. So when we hear clips from people like Amandla Stenberg, which I showed above, well, we know that she is out to lunch, that she probably isn't someone who previously appreciated these films. The same thing goes for Charlie Barnett, who pipes up a moment later, and I just don't understand how they could possibly believe this stuff about the franchise that they are currently involved in.
I don't think I could have ever imagined myself as a Jedi. Yes, one's because I was not reflected for so many times throughout these films in the past.
This party's over.
But it was just also something that it didn't equate in my mind. I don't know about for you guys as well. So to see such a diverse group played out now,
I'm sorry.
I know that it's going to be a healthy.
I'm sorry too.
Reflection on so many other young people and old people.
I am the Senate. Everyone can
Master Windu. I mean, no ageism allowed in this. It's Star Wars. We can all fit.
But those who are not nerds, those who I refer to here as casuals or normies, those folks are the target audience for statements like that, and they eat that shit up. As a result, a lot of normies and casuals will nowadays start from the baseline assumption that these stories are inherently problematic. They think this often because the media tells them so. Since that is their baseline assumption, they won't actually give the original thing its fair due, because according to their values, that would mean giving time and money to hateful content. So instead, they rely upon assumptions about these story worlds, which they have not actually taken the time to experience for themselves. This allows them to paint the fans of those story worlds with broad, generalized brushstrokes. My point is, in the modern age, in the 2020s, when a normie and a nerd enter a debate, they are usually bringing two entirely incompatible worldviews to the table. It's almost like speaking a different language entirely. When a baseline worldview cannot be established, an argument can only divide people further. It cannot bring those people together. So to all my fellow nerds, I would bring this small bit of advice to the table. Don't argue with normies about nerd stuff. Because to be honest, once the argument has begun, you gotta realize that the other person has already made up their mind about you. They already believe that you are a bigot. They just believe that you yourself might not be aware of it. That's the only reason they are bothering to debate you at all. Make no mistake, they're trying to educate you. They think they're doing you a favor. So just don't get involved. Don't participate. So let's linger on this humdinger of an article for just a moment, because I think it effectively illustrates what I'm talking about here. So the article is titled, Magic the Gathering Lord of the Rings Aragorn is Black. Please get over it. And the subtitle reads, if you're seriously upset that Magic the Gathering Lord of the Rings Aragorn is black instead of white, then you need to be asking yourself some hard questions. So first off, I'll point out the brazen normalization of this idea that the Lord of the Rings is racist. The author Matt Bassel starts right out of the gate, writing, the Lord of the Rings, though widely and rightly considered one of the greatest fantasy stories of all time, doesn't do so great on the whole diversity thing. Bassel goes on to write, just like when Amazon's Rings of Power show dared to present viewers with a black hobbit, a rotten subsection of so-called fans are raising a big stink about this. Obviously, it's really depressing to see such predictable racism rearing its head in the Magic the Gathering community, especially given the inroads into inclusivity Wizards seems to have been making. It's also been cathartic to see big Magic content creators respond to the outrage and fragility with mockery and a verbal middle finger. Alright, cathartic for whom? Because Matt Bassel is clearly white. Is he speaking for himself here?
How many of you sitting in this room have even seen a black person? None of you!
Yeah. So what Wizards of the Coast is doing is cathartic for white virtue signalers, but not necessarily for black nerds. Bassel goes on. Yet so many of those making RC comments shirk away from the R accusation, seeking out a more palatable excuse instead. So again, just think about how normalized this idea is, that these older fandoms are racist and deserve to be given the verbal middle finger. But then we move on to the part that really frustrates me. This statement here. Matt Bassel writes, it seems like most of the complainers allege that they just want the cards to be accurate and true to Tolkien's vision, pulling up quotes to show how Aragorn and others are described in the books. Obviously, I am highly skeptical of this. I think this reasoning is generally just a fig leaf, poorly disguising the uglier true intent behind the outrage. But if it's not just a bad faith excuse, and you're genuinely upset about Aragorn being black instead of white on a Magic the Gathering card, then you really need to think long and hard about where those feelings are coming from. No one likes to hear that they're racist, so I'll be kind, and do this gently. Okay.
So the next time you privileged suburban white boys think Beethoven wasn't black, maybe you should look in the mirror!
I have no idea what he's talking about, but I feel terrible.
Pay attention to the tone that the author takes here. It's so condescending. So holier than thou. Matt Bassel knows what's right and what's virtuous, and by God, he's going to help you become as virtuous as he is, if you accept that he knows better than you. Because of how volatile discourse is these days, I'll remind the viewer that I am not white. And if you're going to accuse me, then, of carrying internalized racism because I dared to disagree with something that Matt Bassel said, come on now. That just reeks of actual racism itself. People of color are not a monolith. So, here's one good, non-racist reason why someone might reject African Aragorn as depicted on that Magic card. The reason is that what we can see here is a clear instance of pandering. It's actually really, really disrespectful to turn to an entire community of people and say, here, look, I'm doing this for you. I'm changing something that already exists to be more palatable for you. You have to like this now. But that's exactly what happens when large corporations pander to minority groups. The existence of this magic card is not doing a favor for black people. It is virtue signaling from a small group of white people who are more concerned about being perceived as non-racist than they are about actually taking care to make sure they're not being racist. So no, you don't have to like this card, whether you're black, white, brown, or anything in between. But if you are a person of color, someone who's brown or black or Asian, or a mix of some or all of those things like me, then you don't have to let Wizards of the Coast bully you here. You don't have to like this card, and you don't have internalized racism if that's the case. And I know I can't speak for everyone here. If you are a black nerd and you like these African Aragorn magic cards, then God bless. I'm not trying to hate on you. I mean, admittedly, the cards do look pretty cool. If these images had been presented as part of a new original fantasy world, I would have been all over it. But this is not Lord of the Rings as I know it. And here's a second reason why someone might reject African Aragorn as depicted on that magic card. Aragorn is not canonically black in Middle-earth, but Tolkien's extended writings do depict a number of canonically black regions and characters. What Wizards of the Coast seem to be assuming here, with the release of this magic card, is that there are no black fans of the Lord of the Rings books well versed in the extended lore who may well have wanted to see themselves included in the magic card Middle-earth series. And not included as a race-swapped variation of an established character, which changes what is established in canon, but included as a canonically accurate black character who could be shown to stand alongside a canonically white Aragorn. I know what would have meant more to me, personally at least, and that would have been to see a canonically dark-skinned character stand next to a version of Aragorn who looked like Viggo Mortensen's portrayal of the character. Because Wizards of the Coast made an assumption here, a wrong one. They assumed that among the group of Lord of the Rings fans to whom the lore is deeply important, there are no people of color. What stunts like this from Wizards of the Coast ultimately say is that if you're African, the only condition under which you get to see yourself in Middle-earth is when it's non-canonical. And what it says to everyone else is that for people of color to be properly represented, white people have to get out of the way. How is that inclusive? That's divisive, not inclusive. And it doesn't help us come together as fellow human beings. What gets me about this is that it didn't have to be this way. Like, what about Alatar and Palando, the Ithrin Luin, the two blue wizards of the Istari, sent to the east and south of Middle-earth? Is it not far more realistic and compatible with canon that Alatar and Palando could have been dark-skinned or more Asiatic in appearance in order to fit in with the societies that they found in the east and south of Middle-earth? So, to Matt Bassel, and the virtue signalers like him, who don't think that there's any non-racist reason to dislike what Wizards of the Coast did here, well, I'm a brown guy, and I have Caribbean heritage, and I fundamentally reject that notion.
그 영화를 찍을 때는 어떤 한국적인 코리안 뉘앙스 같은 거에 되게 충실했고 표면적으로 그 한국적인 디테일들로 꽉 찬 영화라고 생각했는데 막상 완성돼서 여러 나라에서 영화를 틀어보니까 다들 똑같은 뜨거운 반응이 있어가지고 아 이게 되게 유니버설한 스토리였구나. 왜냐하면 우리가 하나의 나라에서 살고 있다 지금 하나의 거대한 나라 자본주의라는 나라인 거죠. 그래서 똑같은 유니버설한 반응이 있나 봐요. 예.
These time-honored stories which we cherish are about how we're all the same ultimately, not about how we're all different. And I fear that modern Hollywood storytellers are trying to teach us otherwise. I heard someone say recently that Hollywood no longer believes in heroic deeds, only in heroic identities. And I believe it. But that's not what I was taught growing up by the stories that I love. I was taught that despite the surface level characteristics and geographical differences which distinguish us, we all as humans experience the same things in life. Love, hope, happiness, triumph, conflict, desperation, fear, grief, loss, sorrow, sickness, loneliness, togetherness, friendship, death. These things all transcend barriers of color or creed, and these stories are supposed to show us that, remind us of that, teach us that. If a story is well told, then you do not need to be like any of the characters in that story to be moved by it. And if you really are desperate to see yourself, exactly yourself, in a story, then don't expect other people to do it for you. Nobody has to represent anybody. And if you need to see someone who is exactly like yourself represented in a story, then, I'm sorry to say, you're going to have to go and write that story yourself.